Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld I'm Brent, and in this video I'm going to be talking to you about the most competitive secondary objective picks for Craftworld players. Now, before I dive in, a quick shout out to those of you who read my blog regularly and are frequent visitors to the website. You might be somewhat annoyed that on June 5th I posted an article on all of the chapter approved stuff that included a play-by-play of the secondary objectives. Don't worry, there's new content coming for you in just a few days. I'm working on a unit focus video on the Avatar of Cain, and then there's more to follow. So I get it. I understand if you're excited for new content, and the reason that sometimes I'm going to do videos that are redundant with articles on the blog is that I have worked out from comments on video content that many people, I think almost everybody who's reading the blog is watching the YouTube channel, but I think most of the people who are watching the YouTube channel are maybe not reading the blog. So stuff that's really relevant to everybody and really key, I'm going to do videos probably as well as articles for those of you who, that's your preferred way of accessing 40K content. You want to watch videos, that's fine. So for the really essential stuff, I'm going to double tap it. So that's what we're doing today. And before I do the secondary by secondary analysis, I want to say one thing about picking secondaries generally. And again, apologies to those of you who are veteran competitive players for whom this seems super obvious. But the most common mistake that I see new competitive players making, either people who are new to 40K or coming from an earlier edition, is treating secondary objectives as an afterthought, picking them when they get to the table. When you are doing your list construction, it is as important to think about how you're going to score secondary objectives as it is to think about how you're going to score primary objectives. They're worth just as many points. And I actually think that thinking about objective scoring is arguably even more important than thinking about how you're going to eliminate your opponent's units. Many new players at list construction, when they're making that transition to competitive list construction, focus mostly on target elimination and not enough on this other stuff. So you have to think about this while you're list building. Okay. All right. Post-chapter approved 2021, many of the secondary options have changed. There are still broad categories of secondary objective. I think there's 5. Is that right? Yeah, there's 5 different categories of secondary objective, each of which has multiple choices, and a player can choose only a single secondary objective from each of these categories. So in some cases, whether or not something is good, really, it might be that individual secondary objective would be pretty good for a Craftworld's player, but it's not great because there's something else from that same category that is just objectively easier to score, right? And so that's another consideration that I will be paying attention to as we go. So we're going to dive in. The first of these categories, battlefield supremacy. So this is a category of secondary objectives that rewards players for board control. And if you've been playing competitive Eldar for a while, at least since the beginning of 9th edition, you probably already know that battlefield supremacy is arguably the place where Eldari shine, Craftworld Eldari shine most. We're very good at board control, which is actually a little bit surprising when you consider that we're not a horde army. We tend to have small, elite, expensive units, and Craftworld's units are famously not durable. So normally, armies that are good at board control tend to be good at board control because they either have hordes that are hard to eliminate, can spread out, or their units are simply tough to eliminate, like Space Marines. What makes Craftworld so effective at board control is their sheer mobility, right? The speed with which we can be everywhere at once really makes this particular category of secondaries a great pick for us. It's a rare Craftworld's list that is not going to use at least one of these. Well, you can only use one of these. It's not going to use one of these. So the first option in battlefield supremacy is engage on all fronts. This is one of the only secondary objectives that has not changed from the pre-chapter approved 2021 days. And it is wonderful that this has not changed because it probably remains the single best secondary objective option for Craftworld's list. Engage on all fronts works like this. A player scores 3 victory points per turn for having at least one unit wholly within each table quarter and at least 6 inches from the center of the battlefield, or 2 victory points if that player is only able to occupy 3 table quarters. So this is fabulous for us. If in theory, if you score 3 victory points per turn with this, you get to 15, which is the maximum for a secondary objective. That's pretty good. Because we have so many units with really high movement values, it's pretty easy to make this work. It also has fantastic synergy with a couple of the other secondary objectives that are really good picks for Eldar. And for me, that's really what puts this over the edge, is that because I can include a couple of units in my army that are going to help me score other secondaries, and those relatively inexpensive units will help me also score this one. I almost always take this in competitive play. The units that I'm thinking of in particular, Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders, which I'm going to talk about when we get to retrieve Octarius data, are very helpful with this. But the trick with Engage on All Fronts, so here's my trick with Engage on All Fronts. It can be very difficult to score in the early game because sometimes, that board control, we're relying on deep strikers. Craftworld players have a lot of units that deep strike without additional CP expense. I already mentioned those 2 aspect units, Swooping Hawks and Warp Spiders, but also our scout unit, our Eldar Rangers. Eldar Rangers are not good, but having a single unit of Eldar Rangers in a list sometimes makes sense purely for secondary objectives because you don't have to spend CP on the deep strike. We have a stratagem that lets us put additional units into deep strike. So, maybe you have a unit of Dire Avengers that's in the webway. It can be used to help you score this. And our War Walkers, there's a bunch of options. But the trick to making this work early game, when on turn 1, you don't have access to deep strikers. And then on turn 2, oftentimes there's still so many units on the board that your opponent can make it very difficult to deep strike units onto your opponent's side of the board. Against some armies, the opponent can completely lock you out. And that can be a real punch in the gut if you're relying on Engage on All Fronts. So I think this is one of the best opportunities to get mileage out of Vipers and Wind Riders. So when I am running Engage on All Fronts, and as I mentioned, I usually do, I will often include a couple of Vipers totally stripped down, right? In my opinion, the best build for a Viper that you're using to help you with target elimination is probably Expert Crafters and a Star Cannon. But when you're relying on Vipers to help you score Engage on All Fronts, particularly on turn 1, there's no point in putting a Star Cannon on the Viper because it probably needs to make an advance move. It definitely needs to make an advance move. And then it won't be able to fire that heavy weapon. It really doesn't matter if you have Expert Crafters or not with this Viper build because they're not in there to do a lot of killing. So the way I do this is going to turn into a first turn tactic on Engage on All Fronts, which is not what I'm intending to do. I promise to talk less about the other ones. But I do think this might be helpful to some of you. So I find it useful to run 2 Vipers. I start them on my flanks. I just give them the Shuriken Cannon, the cheapest build, and then you make advance moves with them. You may need to quicken one if things don't go well. The other one, you can always use Matchless Agility to guarantee you get a full advance move. That'll get both of the Vipers past the middle line of the board, guarantee that you can score 3 for Engage on All Fronts first turn, and then those Vipers serve another really important purpose. If your opponent has units that have a forward deployment where they can deploy anywhere on the board, not within 9 inches of enemy units and not too close to your enemy's deployment zone, your Vipers can eliminate those units. So stuff like Mandrakes and Rust Stalkers, you zip into the midfield turn 1, you blast your opponent's forward units off the board. It makes it really hard for you. If your opponent was counting on moving forward with those units to score Engage on All Fronts herself, now you're taking that away from her. And the Vipers might not be able to do it on their own. You might need some support fire from some weapon with indirect, like a Night Spinner or maybe even a Wraithseer with one of those D cannons. But generally, there is enough. If you have those 2 Shuriken Cannons and the twin-linked Shuriken Catapults on each bike, there is enough firepower there to eliminate at least 1 minimum-sized unit of forward infantry. And the other thing that those Vipers can do for you is that they can put some pressure on forward objectives. They become a target priority for your opponent, and if your opponent's dealing with them on turn 1, your other units might not be threatened. The other thing that you can do is use a minimum sized squad of Wind Riders. Wind Riders are not in a great place right now, especially when you compare them to Reavers, which are just more for the same points. But a minimum unit of 3 Wind Riders, right, with the catapults, so that's 60 points, is also great at this. It's 10 points more than the Viper, but in some ways it's actually preferable because when they advance, they automatically move the 6 inches. They have Ride the Wind, right? So you're not relying on a psychic power or a stratagem to make sure, right? Sometimes it's sort of questionable. Wind Riders definitely get to the midfield. They have a comparable amount of firepower if they're going to eliminate an enemy unit. And although they're not as durable as the Viper in terms of toughness and armor save, because there are 3 of them, they're less vulnerable to heavy weapons. So say a las cannon, which is pretty much guaranteed to vaporize the Viper unless your opponent flubs the wound roll, or not guaranteed, but it's likely. Your Wind Riders, that's 1 bike, right? So it takes a different kind of firepower to eliminate Wind Riders. And you might even be able to use Fire and Fade, right, to move one of those Wind Rider units or Vipers out of line of sight so they can keep scoring for you the next turn. This opening, I love this opening. It creates real problems for the opponent. It guarantees you the 3 points, and it's worth the extra 100 points. That's 5% of your list to guarantee that you can do it. Okay, I'm done. I'll stop. And I won't talk about any of the other ones as much as I talked about that one. It's just something that I've found really invaluable in some of my more competitive builds, and I couldn't help myself. And that, my friends, was not all in the article on the website. So if you already read the article, I'm not totally wasting your time. Okay, next option, behind enemy lines. So this is the new version of a line breaker. And for Craftworlds, it's an improvement over the older version. The way it works is if you have 1 non-aircraft unit in your opponent's deployment zone at the end of your turn, you score 2 VP. If you can have 2 units, you score 4 victory points. In theory, Eldar should be really good at this because we're so fast. But I think that in 2,000 point play, this one really isn't very good. Maybe in scenarios where there's 1 long deployment zone across the back of the field and you're playing a small elite army that will maybe, but is it really ever going to be better than Engage on All Fronts? I have some serious doubt. Of course, there's always an exception, right? There's going to be some matchup in which your opponent is playing Custodes. They can't spread out. They've got a really small elite force. They can't spread out in that back. They need to move forward to claim objectives, and you know you can do this. I don't know. But where I think behind on enemy lines actually shines is in 500 point play. In a 500 point game, you can have a single unit of even striking scorpions, as subpar as they are. They're really good for this. Pop up in your opponent's backfield, even though the board is smaller. Usually in 500 point play, an opponent just isn't able to control the backfield and still do all the things she needs to do. And you don't have enough units to score Engage on all fronts. So small point value games, yeah, behind enemy lines, great pick. 2,000 point play, I think you always would prefer Engage on all fronts to this, probably. Stranglehold, the third option, last option. So this is the new version of Domination, and this is, I think, the only place in Chapter Approved 2021 where Craftworlds are worse off than they were before. And not because we were ever going to do that. We were never going to... Stranglehold is pretty much never going to be a good idea, and Domination was never a good idea. The way it works is you score 3 victory points at the end of your turn if you control at least 3 primary objectives and you control more than your opponent. Now, primary objective control is probably the area in which Craftworld Eldar struggles the most. So I think this one's a trap. I don't think it's a good idea. If this is working for you, you are going to win the game anyway hard without it. But the reason that it's a losing proposition, or it's a bad change for us, is that it makes it easier for your opponent to score it, right? Because before, in a match with 6 objectives, the way that the rules for the old version of this were written, your opponent needed to hold 4 objective markers to score this, because they needed to hold more than half of the objectives on the table, and that's not true anymore. When there's 6 objectives on the table, your opponent can now score it with only 3. And so this is a minor blow to Craftworlds, but it's not that big a deal, and it only matters against opponents who want to play this. So that's it. Battlefield Supremacy. Engage on all fronts. That's the best option. Probably the best competitive option overall for Eldar. Behind enemy lines, maybe the best option for 500 point play. Second section, no mercy, no respite. So of the three options here, two of them have gotten a big makeover. The first one is called no prisoners. This used to be called thin their ranks. And this, I think, is a solid win for Craftworlds. This is the new version of this. I actually think it's kind of the sleeper option for Craftworlds in the new chapter of Purge. So you might remember the way thin their ranks worked was you got one victory point at the end of the game for every 10 models that you destroyed. And so this worked really well against horde armies, right? If you're playing against an orc horde, low wound value horde armies, right? So some army of massive numbers of demonettes or massive numbers of orc boys, maybe this was great. But it a lot of the time, right? Because Space Marines were very popular when this got started. There's just a lot of armies that were running sort of smaller MSU style lists. This wasn't getting a ton of play, and this changed from dead models to wounds. So the way prisoners works is you now get one victory point for every 10 wounds of models you deal to enemy units that are not vehicles, characters, and monsters. So they've tried to balance it by not giving you points for vehicles, characters, and monsters. But what you do get points now for are multi-wound heavy infantry, right? So a Custodes model or a Terminator's model that's worth 3 wounds is worth 3 ticks. And if your opponent resurrects something and you kill it again, you score it again, right? So against most opponents, against the vast majority of opponents, this is worth at least 6 or 7 points, which for your third secondary is often good. I think you want to be able to get to 12 to 15 with your first one, 10 to 13 with your second one, and probably 7 to 10 with your third one, sort of minimally in competitive play. That's what I usually look for. So for this one, I think it's an option. It's a third choice against most opponents, and against many opponents where you stand a reasonable chance of getting to 10 or more, it's a great second. It's a second tier. It's fabulous. So I love that multi-wound elite armies like Space Marines are no longer just sort of immune to the elimination secondaries because they don't have a ton of vehicles, they don't have a ton of infantry. So this also punishes them a bit. And because Eldar tend to be both fragile, they don't have a lot of wounds, and they're expensive, we're typically giving up way fewer points for this than we stand a chance of scoring. So this change has been really good for Craftworlds players. This is not one that you can go into the game counting on taking, but it's a pretty good backup option against the vast majority of opponents. The next option in the No Mercy, No Respite section is called Grind Them Down. I think this one also hasn't changed, like Engage on All Fronts. You score 3 victory points every round in which you eliminate more units than your opponent. And in theory, this sounds great, right? So when Grind Them Down first came out at the beginning of 9th edition, I remember thinking, oh, that's going to be so good for Craftworlds because we're a small elite army and we're so good at killing things. We're very shooty with Doom and some great heavy weapons. And it turns out Grind Them Down is generally not a great option for Craftworlds. And the reason for this is that currently MSU-style lists are hugely incentivized for craft. So an MSU-style list is minimum-sized units. If you are running a competitive Craftworlds list, it's likely that you want to engage on all fronts, which benefits from fast, mobile, small units. It's likely that you're running Retrieve Octarius data, which I'm going to talk about later, which benefits from fast, very small, relatively cheap infantry units. Expert crafters, the sometimes hated, obviously best Craftworld bonus available to Craftworlds players. Again, it benefits from very small units. So the result is a lot of competitive Craftworlds lists have a lot of pretty expensive, fast-moving, hard-hitting, very small units that individually aren't that hard to kill. And the result is that Grind Them Down, it turns out to not be a great option. So it looks great on paper, but unless you are running a list with large units that is not trying to score engage on all fronts, and there are lists that do that, right? Ulthway, for example, really benefits from relying on stratagems and psychic buffs to max out the damage of larger units. So if you're playing a traditional Craftworld list, you're not using at crafters and perhaps you are not focusing on the board control secondaries that are the low-hanging fruit, this might work for you, but in fact, it could be great in that situation. But I think for the vast majority of competitive lists, this is not going to be a tempting pick. All right, to the last. So this is the new version of While We Stand, While We Fight. It's changed trivially. Now, if you're While We Stand, While We Fight unit, so the While We Stand, While We Fight, that's the secondary where your 3 most expensive units are each worth 5 victory points if they survive to the end of the battle. Well, there's kind of a loophole because some units like Tyranid Carnifexes, for example, can split at the beginning of the game into smaller units. And so you could pull a scam where, technically it's a unit of 3, but 2 of them go off to fight and one of them just hides. That doesn't really work anymore insofar as if you split a unit and it only partially survives, now you only score part of the points. We weren't using this one anyway, much. Some people do. I shouldn't say we weren't because I sometimes do. But While We Stand, We Fight it's incredibly tricky for Craftworlds, but you can do it. For some armies, Death Guard, for example, it's frequently just an auto-include. If you have expensive units that are easy to keep alive and hard-hitting because they're super tough, it might also not require much finesse to get mileage out of it if you're running 3 Plague Burst Crawlers or something. But for Craftworlds, all our units are pretty fragile, and it's hard to score this. It's hard to... There's almost nothing in your army that a dedicated opponent can't kill if he or she sets his or her mind to it. So there is a way in which this is really good, though. So I think the best use of To the Last for a Craftworlds player is not so much to count on scoring a bunch of points, but as a third option, right? So say you're scoring more with 2 other ones. That might get you 5 points, maybe, but really what you're doing is you are forcing your opponent to make hard choices about what units to target. So you can force somebody to put disproportionate resources into destroying a super buffed unit, like 5 souped up Wraith Blades with, you can with a stratagem, you can make them -1 to hit. With a psychic power, you can give them a 3-up invuln, and then with fortune, another psychic power, you can give them a 5-up feel no pain. And a unit of 5 Wraith Blades with all of those bonuses is incredibly resource intensive to eliminate. It's just brutal to try to get rid of. And so potentially you force your opponent to choose between eliminating, say, a primary objective holder and a unit that gives you 5 points at the end of the game, or some hard-hitting tank and a unit that gives you 5 points at the end of the game. So if you play this with great finesse, I think it's really good. I think it's top shelf, top tier, but you've got to build around it. You've got to plan for it. And I think that to do a really good job with this, you've got to either really know what you're doing with Craftworld Eldar. No, there's no if then. You do. You have to really know what you're doing with Craftworld Eldar. But if you do, and you include a unit of Wraithblades and maybe the Avatar with Avatar Resurgent. There was actually a list. Sorry, I'm getting on a tangent again. There was a list, a Craftworld mixed Eldari list that won a GT, I think back during the summer, that featured the Avatar of Cain. I got really excited about that because I love the Avatar, and it's typically regarded as being so bad. I think it's gotten much better recently. I'm going to do a video about that soon. But an army featuring the Avatar of Cain and the Avatar Resurgence, so you're bringing it back every turn in melee for 3 command points, and some Wraithblades souped up in this way did really well, not because it was scoring a lot for those units, but because it was forcing the opponent to just way overcommit for eliminating them. So I think you want to, maybe this is a great pick, but you want to be cautious if this is the direction you go, that you really know how to make it work. Okay, Shadow Operations. Shadow Operations, I think, has one standout great pick for Craftworlds. I've already mentioned Retrieve Octarius data, but we'll go through all of them. The first one is Raise the Banners High. This is a popular one for Space Marines. It's never been a great pick for Craftworlds. This hasn't changed since the pre-chapter approved version of 9th edition. essentially you move an infantry unit onto an objective. That unit raises the banners, and now that objective is worth essentially an additional point each turn every time you score. So now you're getting 6 points for it instead of 5 or whatever, plus an additional point at the end of the game. If you have a bunch of super tough OBSEC units that want to waddle onto an objective and then hold it until the last turn, this is great. As a Craftworld player with, Dire Avengers running around with Asserman or something, maybe you could make this work for you on one objective, maybe two. Usually, though, I think that if you do this on one objective for the whole game, I guess that's 5 or 6 points if you did it for the whole game. But that's really just not enough, I don't think, to make it a great pick as a secondary. I think that if you were playing against somebody who's less experienced and it was a casual game and you wanted to have play be more balanced, and so you're going to choose some objectives that you can score points for, but maybe you're not going to max out, I think Raise the Banners High would be a very sporting choice. But I think for competitive play for most Craftworld's list, it probably doesn't make the grade. Investigate Signal. Investigate Signal is like Investigate Sites, which it replaced. It allows you to score points for dominating the center of the map. You score 3 victory points if an infantry unit performs Investigate Sites wholly within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield. And at the end of the turn, there are no enemy units wholly within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield. This is okay for Craftworlds, but it only makes sense for really specific lists in really specific matchups. Because on the one hand, right, Craftworld's units are fast, so you can get to the middle of the board. And in addition, we're pretty good at choosing one thing and definitely killing it, right? If you cast Doom on something and you cast Jinx on that thing and you shoot it with all of the things, there's very little that Craftworlds can't eliminate in a single round if they get off those 2 psychic powers. So even a bunch of Death Shroud Terminators squatting in the middle of the board with Doom and Jinx, we stand a pretty good chance of getting rid of them. The problem is that Craftworlds are super fragile themselves and very expensive. And so every turn you do this, whatever you put in the middle of the board to try to pull this off, all of that stuff is likely to be killed. There are ways to do this so that it works. If you are running those souped up Wraith Blades I mentioned before, and maybe you even stick the Avatar of Cain in the middle of them with the Avatar Resurgent ready to go a bunch of times, that's a tough nut to crack. There are ways to play this if you really build for it. The deal breaker for me is that Retrieve Octarius data is just so much easier and less resource intensive, which I'm going to talk about next. But you might consider Investigate Signal if you really build for it. The other thing that I don't love about this one is that there tends to not be necessarily an objective marker right in the middle of the board, and so the psychic powers that you would normally be using to buff your objective holders so that they stand some chance of scoring before they're murdered, now those psychic powers have to be used probably to buff whatever is trying to hold the center of the board. Now, and that creates resource friction. You could argue that it makes your opponent make hard choices, and so maybe. But again, I think this is an option for a highly skilled player with a very particular plan. Retrieve Octarius data, on the other hand, is low-hanging fruit. This is the new version of Scramblers. It is, for Craftworlds, it is better than Scramblers. That is a somewhat controversial claim. Some people some Craftworlds players are mourning the loss of Scramblers, but I'm going to tell you why I think Scramblers, although it was great for us, was not as good as this option. So the way Retrieve Octarius data works is once per turn, a single infantry unit can perform the Retrieve Octarius data action if it is wholly within 1 table quarter and at least 6 inches from every other table quarter. So you may remember that before you had to do this once in your deployment zone, once in your opponent's deployment zone, and once not in a deployment zone. So in that sense, it was easier in that you only had to do it 3 times. It was harder in that you did have to do it in your opponent's deployment zone, and there's one mission with a particularly narrow deployment area that was just really easy to lock people out of for scramblers. And the old version of when this was called Scramblers, it was worth 10 points at the end of the game if you succeeded all 3 times, and 0 points if you didn't. 2 things I love about Retrieve Octarius data. 1, you don't need to get into your opponent's deployment zone, and as such, it's almost impossible to screen you out of this if you have the units necessary to perform this. The other thing I like about it is that if your very savvy, exceptional opponent does manage to screen you out of a quarter of the board for the entire game, you still score 8 points, because this is worth 12 points at the end of the game, not 10, if you do it all 4 times. But if you only do it 3 times, it's worth 8, and if you only do it twice, it's worth 4. And so that's one of the big differences between secondaries before and secondaries now, is that post 2021 chapter approved, secondaries tend to be the all or nothing secondaries are gone, and now it's incremental, which is, I just think, better for game balance. But because craft worlds have infantry units that can perform actions that are super fast, right? So swooping hawks are super fast, and warp spiders have the Exarch power in the Phoenix Rising book. You can swap out their Exarch power for Web of Deceit, which allows them to, bamf like Nightcrawler somewhere else on the board. It's a deep strike action for which they don't actually need to leave the board for a turn. So instead of moving them, you just move them as though they deep strike. If you have a unit of swooping hawks and a unit of warp spiders, you stand a pretty good chance of being able to pull this off, and that's just not a lot of points to invest. And it also they will also be helping you score engage on all fronts while they're doing this, without any additional consideration, really, right? So this has great synergy with engage on all fronts, which we already want to be doing. It's a great option. One of the things that has caused some people to be a bit grumpy is this new limitation that requires a unit to be wholly within a table quarter and 6 inches from every other table quarter, because now you can't have a unit of Dire Avengers just like run 5 inches and do the action the next turn. And yes, it was nice when we could do that. But if you think about that limitation in terms of the game more broadly, you will realize that it is a huge win for craft worlds, because we have pretty fast infantry. We've got a base move of 7, and then if we advance, we can reasonably hope to move 10. And if we have that matchless agility stratagem, so you can always max out the movement for one of your units and move 13, and that's a regular unit. That's not even the swooping hawks, for example, which are just ridiculously quick. So it's so much easier for us to do this than it is for everybody else to do it, that I think the fact that it got a bit harder is still a net win for us, because it's way harder for everybody else. I love this one. I've played a bunch of games since Chapter Approved dropped, and this has been fabulous in all of them. So I think you're really going to like it. And if you're already building for Engage on All Fronts, you can also build for this one. It doesn't require a lot of additional resources. The last option from this section, Deploy Teleport Homers, is just a slightly better version of Teleport Homer, which was the old secondary. Essentially, you have now either infantry or bikes can do it. I think before it was just infantry. You perform the Deploy Teleport Homer action within 12 inches of the enemy deployment zone. That's also a difference. I think before you actually had to be in it. And if the unit survives until your next command phase, you score 4 VP. If you're in your opponent's deployment zone, and 2 VP if you're within 12 inches of it. This is in 2,000 point play. This is very foolish indeed. Don't do it. The fact that the unit has to survive is just a huge deal breaker for craft worlds. I guess if you're Space Elf Sun Tzu and you are sacrificing 2 command points to force your opponent to kill a super tough unit to divert maybe, right? There's some way to do this where you're manipulating your opponent into destroying your unit. But for the most part, manipulating your opponent into destroying your units tends to just not be a great manipulation for a craft worlds, and very unthematic. I mean, there are only so many elves left. So I'm going to say Deploy Teleport Homers is a reasonable pick in 500-point games, right? There are going to be lots of times in 500-point play where your opponent just doesn't have enough to be able to kill something that's out of line of sight or a little bit tough. I don't know what's a little bit tough that you would include in a 500-point game that would do this. I mean, Wraithblades are good, but they're not going to be doing this in a 500-point game. But anyway, 2,000-point play, I think this is silly, especially when you put it next to Retrieve Octarius data or even Investigate Signal. All right, Purge the Enemy. This is the killy set of secondaries. For some reason, it's another killy set of secondaries, right? Because No Mercy, No Respite is also a killy set of secondaries. The first of these, Assassination, is a slightly modified version of Assassinate. You get 3 victory points for every character you kill, plus an extra point for the Warlord. It's highly situational. If you are playing against an opponent with lots of very killable characters, I think this is a great pick. If you are playing against an opponent without a lot of very killable characters, obviously you are not taking this. I think that a good dipstick for whether or not this is a reasonable include is, are you certain you can get to 9? If you feel absolutely sure you can get to 9, then if something goes wrong and you get to 6 and this is your third one, hopefully it won't cost you the game. That's still a reasonable score. But if you can definitely get to 9, maybe you can get to 12, right? It's against certain opponents, it's great. It's a great option. Whether or not, let's assume for a moment you are doing Retrieve Octarius data and Engage on all fronts. Your third pick is likely to be either Grind Them, the new version of Grind Them Down, Take no Prisoners, I think it's called. Whatever no prisoners replaced, Thin Their Ranks, no prisoners, or Assassination. This is, you will know immediately which is the stronger pick. It also doesn't require a lot of finesse. It's very straightforward. Titan Hunter is the next one. It's the same as the old version, but it's way worse. Now you only earn 4 points for destroying a single Titanic model, 9 points for destroying 2, 15 points for destroying 3. If your opponent's playing Knights, you probably are taking this, and if not, you definitely are not. Bring It Down remains a popular choice against vehicle-heavy lists. It is unchanged since the January FAQ. You get 1 victory point for destroying a vehicle unit with a wounds characteristic of 10 or less, 2 victory points for 11 to 19 wounds, 3 victory points for 20 or more wounds. I think it also works on monsters. Bring It Down, against some lists, Bring It Down is excellent. I really like this change to Bring It Down. So I got a slight change in the January FAQ that was good for us because now units like Wraithlord, stuff that's worth exactly 10 wounds, right, is now only worth a single victory point, which is good. It makes it harder to score killing Eldar, which have quite a few vehicles that they like to run. Last consideration with Bring It Down. You might... So if you look at your opponent's list and they're running a bunch of vehicles and you know they're models that you need to eliminate, maybe this is a good pick for you. With all the elimination... So we'll just zoom out for a minute. If you're choosing between Bring It Down, Assassinate, and No Prisoners, let's imagine that all of them are scoreable against an opponent's army. Choose the one that will favor destroying the units that you need to kill for other reasons. So I tend to favor, all things being equal, No Prisoners, because those are probably their objective holders, right? And so, or maybe units that are performing actions to try to score secondary objectives for your opponent. So if you can incentivize killing units that you need to kill anyway, that's probably better than incentivizing units that you merely could kill, right, if you decided to. The last consideration with Bring It Down is when you are building your list, you may, and I emphasize may here, want to consider how many points you're potentially giving up for Bring It Down. So if, for example, we go back to Engage on all fronts, I said you should take 2, maybe consider taking 2 Vipers. Well, one reason to take Wind Riders instead of Vipers, or 1 Viper and 1 squad of Wind Riders, is if your opponent is taking Bring It Down, you're giving up a point probably for each of those Vipers. But I definitely wouldn't worry if you have 8 or 9 potentially 8 or 9 victory points of vehicles in your list, and some of those are going to be reasonably hard to get to, like a Night Spinner or something. It's not something to worry about. Also, Craftworld vehicles are really good. Ideally, don't let your opponent get to 15, but you need a bunch of vehicles, right? To some degree, we take it on the chin a little bit. But the January change has definitely been good because it's lowered the reward for some of those vehicles, and that only favors us. Is there anything I'm forgetting to tell you about? I feel like I had one more thing, but I'm not coming up with it. So there it is. Bring it down. Maybe not as strong as no prisoners if you have the choice between them. If you don't, then this is a great pick. If you're confident that you can get to at least 8 points with it as a third option. The last section, Warpcraft, is the most, I think, deceptive for newer players. These are secondary objectives that one scores with certain psychic shenanigans. And so, in theory, this should be great for Eldar because we have some of the most powerful psykers in the game. And there is some play here, but the Warpcraft options also can be a big trap. And we'll talk all about it. The first option in Warpcraft is obviously not for Craftworld's players. It's called Abhor the Witch. A player scores 3 VP for every psychic character they kill, and 2 CP for every non-psychic unit. So think like a Wraithseer would be worth 2 CP. It's not a character. And you can only choose Abhor the Witch if you have no psykers in your army. No Craftworld's player, except running a very fluffy, very silly list, will ever be able to take Abhor the Witch. On the bright side, if your opponent is taking Abhor the Witch, that may mean that your opponent has absolutely no psychic denial. And so if your opponent has no psychic denial, your own psychic powers are more likely to succeed. And that actually, I think, is the situation in which it makes tremendous sense as a Craftworlds player to choose one of these other Warpcraft secondaries. So these other secondaries, Pierce the Veil, Warp Ritual, Psychic Interrogation, all of these require you to perform psychic actions. And psychic actions essentially work like psychic powers. They take the place of a psychic power. You can attempt no psychic powers if you attempt a psychic action. That's the first kind of mark against these options for a Craftworlds player, because you usually need your psychic powers to go. Most Craftworlds armies rely on those synergies, so you're not going to not cast Doom with your Farseer or protect Jinx. If you have a bunch of psykers in your army, right? If you say you have 2 Wraithseers and you've got a Farseer and a Spirit Seer, a Farseer, and maybe a Warlock on a jet bike. If you have 4 psykers, right, suddenly this becomes a real possibility, these psychic actions. But the first thing to know about them is they do take the place of actually casting any psychic powers at all. So it's not one cast. Some people think, well, I'll have my Farseer do this once, and no. If you do this, you cast nothing. The other similarity to psychic powers is that these are subject to Deny the Witch. And for me, that is the biggest problem with the psychic actions for victory points, because if your opponent has any psychic denial and they attempt to deny you, they stand like a 40% chance of denying any roll. I mean, if you are running Eldred and he's getting all of his +1s for successful psychic powers, you can make it pretty hard to deny, except you can't do that. That's for psychic powers. It doesn't work on the psychic action. So the best you could do is Seer Council, right, which gives you +1 to your cast. But there's plenty of people out there who have bonuses to their deny. So it's just against an opponent who's running a bunch of psychic denial, these are foolish to attempt. But against an opponent who has very little psychic denial or who has none and is running Abhor the Witch, this is like the tit-for-tat counter to Abhor the Witch. Well, one of these is. So the first option for psychic secondaries is called Warp Ritual, and it is way better than Psychic Ritual, which it replaced. But it's still not great for Craftworlds players. So the way this works is you have to have a psyker within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield. You attempt the Warp Ritual action in your psychic phase. It has a warp charge value of 3, so you're guaranteed to succeed, pretty much. And if you succeed once, you get 3 victory points. If you get 7 if you succeed twice. You get 12 if you succeed 3 times. And unlike the older version, you don't need to keep doing it with the same psyker, right? So it sounds Great. As I said in the article about this, it sounds like a really easy 12 points for Craftworld players. Well, imaginary listener, I am here to tell you that Warp Ritual is not an easy 12 points for a Craftworlds player. For one thing, you need to be able to get your psyker within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield, which is going to be a really tall order against a savvy opponent who wants you to not do that, especially if they are running most of the competitive tier armies in the game. Most of the top tier armies in the game can totally control the center of the board if they want to, better than Craftworlds can. The other problem is that the other problems are the ones that we've already established, right? It's the psychic denial and the fact that you have to give up your casts, right? It's definitely true that there are going to be some opponents against whom this could be freaking great, right? If you look at your opponent's army and you think to yourself, yes, I can control the center of the field, right? Or if you're stacking this with, let's say you've built your entire army around center of the board control because you're planning to also do investigate signal. Do you remember that one? Then maybe, right? If you've got the 6 souped up Wraith Blades with all of the buffs and the Avatar of Cain in the middle of those, and Asserman and a bunch of Dire Avengers, and you're just gonna wade into the middle and you're going to hold it. You put all your eggs in one basket. The thing that I don't love about that build is you've got to build for it, and then you can't choose to do anything else. And against an opponent who's better at that than you are, it could be a tall order. So I think there are a lot of competitive armies that you could destroy with this combo. I think it could potentially work really well. But you have to build your list for it, and I just don't think it is as good a list against all comers as some other options. So that's Warp Ritual. It has some play against very particular matchups, and it has really good synergy with Investigate Sight. Pierce the Veil. This one's unchanged from Chapter Approved 2020. It's a psychic action that one of your psykers performs within 6 inches of your opponent's battlefield edge and at least 6 inches from all enemy models. If you do it twice, it's worth 8 VP, 4 times 15. Pretty hard to pull off against a 2,000 point army. All of our psykers are fragile. They're not going to want to go into the opponent's deployment zone 6 inches from the table edge. And I think if you're running multiple small warlock conclaves on bikes, this might be doable. But again, most opponents can screen you out of at least the back of their deployment zone if they're really motivated. Maybe if it's the long table edge and you have multiple warlock conclaves, this could work for you. But I think that most of the time it's probably not a great option. And even in small point value play, where you have one character model, your warlock on jet bike, this is not he's not going to be doing this. You need him to cast protect on or jinx or something. So Pierce the Veil I think is the weakest option. Psychic Interrogation. This probably has the most legs for a Craftworlds player. So it's the new version of Mental Interrogation, and so the way it works is you need to have a psyker within 24 inches of a visible enemy character. So Psychic Interrogation has replaced Mental Interrogation. Mental Interrogation, the old version of this, did not require line of sight, but it was only 18 inches. Now it's 24 inches, but you need line of sight. It has a warp charge value of 4, and then every time you succeed, you score 3 VP. I think that this is the best option, probably, for most Craftworlds lists against most opponents who are running a Pour the Witch and or don't have any denial. I like that the old version didn't require line of sight, but I think it's a little bit more, this new version is a little bit more user-friendly for Eldar, because the things that most of our psykers really don't want to be too close to the enemy. We can screen them with Look Out, Sir, but melee tends to be somewhat terrifying for our fragile psyker characters, and so being able to stay a little bit further away, even though we need to be able to see the unit, I think may be a win, or maybe it's just a wash. The other advantage to the 24 inches is that if your opponent has a little bit of Deny the Witch, because Deny the Witch is 24 inches, it tends to be harder for your opponent to successfully screen all characters who are vulnerable to being interrogated with their, say, one denial character, now that I can be 24 inches away and do it, right? So I think psychic interrogation, if your opponent doesn't have a lot of denial, and if you have a lot of psykers, I'm thinking 4 or 5, so you have redundant casts where you don't need, their psykers are casting, have the opportunity to do this psychic action, and it doesn't matter that they're not casting their powers. I think this is actually a really strong pick in that matchup. And there are lots of armies that don't run psykers and like Abhor the Witch. So I think this really does have some play. It's situational, but it's not mind-numbingly, insanely situational. I think that if you were to go to a tournament and play 3 games, it's totally reasonable to suppose that in one of those games, this might be one of your 3 best options for a secondary. All right, so that's it. Best secondary options for Craftworlders at the moment. In my opinion, most Craftworld lists will benefit from leaning into engage on all fronts and retrieve Octarius data as first picks, followed circumstantially by no prisoners, bring it down assassination, and possibly also psychic interrogation. More unusual Craftworld rosters might be able to use To the Last or even Stranglehold effectively. And if you are doing that build where you're going for the center of the board, it's possible that the psychic ritual is competitive, but you have to build for that. So there it is. Most competitive secondary options for Craftworld players. If you have other ideas or suggestions, by all means, mention them in the comments below. I'm always looking for new angles for my own play. If you are interested in seeing, if you want the notes, right, you don't want to go back to the video and try to watch it again and find the place where I said the thing. If you head over to craftworldeldar.com and go to my blog and look at the most recent post, you'll see, well, maybe when you watch this video, it will no longer be the most recent post, but there's a recent blog post about Chapter Approved 2021 in which all of the most essential content from this video is there written down for you. And if you have not already liked this video and commented, I would encourage you to do so. If you wish for me to make more videos, if you wish for me to go away, then by all means, I wouldn't expect you to comment. I am aware, I will finish by saying, I am entirely aware that I promised everybody that the next video would be part 2 of how to build a competitive Craftworld list. And so I am confessing, I'm going to renege on that somewhat. In that video, I have linked the webpage on my blog that is in fact part 2. And I might get to that at some point, but I am going to be prioritizing totally new content that's not redundant with the blog, at least for the next couple of months. And it might be that we get our new codex before I actually get around to it. Unless you all tell me that I absolutely have to do it, in which case I will. But I've been getting a lot of requests for videos that aren't that, and so I'm going to prioritize some of this other stuff. Okay, thanks guys. That's it for today. Best of luck in your next game. I will look forward to chatting to you again soon. Take care. Bye.